Physically located downtown.
I'd like to welcome all of you. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody very much for coming. My name is Gunnar Knapp. I'm the director of ISER. I'd like to welcome Courtney for coming to talk today, and I thought what we might do before we get started is just briefly go around the room and give everybody a chance briefly just to say who you are, and then we'll let Courtney get started with her seminar. So I'm Gunnar Knapp. I'm an economist, and I'm the director of ISER.
I'm Steve Offrick. I'm faculty emeritus in public administration.
I'm Lori Hummel. I'm a geographer and former faculty member of geography program at West Point.
I'm Marie Lowe. I'm an anthropologist here at ISER.
I'm Bob Leffler, sort of natural resources teaching and research here at ISER.
I'm Heather Hudson. I work in communication policy. I'm not an economist, and I'm so glad to have the film festival person here who's going to give a pitch. So I should be related. So,
I'm also a blogger, and so I've been blogging at the film festival.
Ian Dutton. I'm also a geographer, but I moonlight with the Rasmussen Foundation.
I'm Ginny Fane, economist with ISER.
Historical economist with ISER.
James Schumink, I'm GIS researcher here at ISER and a recent UAF alum.
My name is Liza Mack. I'm from King Cove. I'm a PhD student in the Indigenous Studies PhD program at UAF, and Courtney is on my dissertation committee, and I am a MESIS fellow.
My name is Ellen Chenoweth. I'm also a MESIS fellow. I'm based out of Sitka, and I'm a graduate student in the Fisheries program.
My name is Jess Grunblatt. I work with GINA, UAF, and also on the EPSCoR projects at Marcel Science Initiative.
Matt Reimer. I'm econ faculty here at ISER.
John Simeone, general public. Just finished dual master's degree in resource economics, University of Washington.
Greg Hayward, U.S. Forest Service, and you guys are gracious enough to let me have an office space up here some of the time, and I really appreciate it.
I'm Faye. I'm a student at UAA.
I'm Jacob.
And so, and Matt, you want to? Great. So let me just again say we're thrilled to have you all here at ISER. And if any of you who aren't from ISER have any questions at any time about what we do here or research that's going on and so on, please at any time feel free to give us a call or call me directly. With that, I'm very pleased to welcome Courtney Carothers. She is an associate professor at the School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at UAF, but recently physically moved to Anchorage, I guess. And with that, I'll let you give the rest of the introduction about yourself and your topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Gunnar. Yeah, thanks so much to Gunnar and also Matt for helping me get organized to give the talk here today. Yeah, so I am a UAF faculty member in fisheries. My background is in anthropology and social science. But yeah, I'm physically based here in Anchorage now, so I wanted to come and help introduce myself around. I've been full-time office down at the Marine Advisory Program, offices downtown, and then part-time at UAA, where I'm teaching over two-way video to UAF all over the state, actually, Fairbanks and Juneau and the remote campuses. And then I have a few students here this semester in Anchorage. So getting to know UAA and really pleased to be part of the community here. So yes, I'm going to be talking about a project today, Fisheries Privatization, Sociocultural Transitions, and Well-Being in Kodiak, Alaska. And this is a project I've been working on. Most recently, it was a 2-3-year project, but I've been working in this topic for about 10 years. I started my dissertation work in Kodiak back in 2005, and so it's a topic I feel very close to. These are meant to come up one by one. Sorry about that. I was going to start, what is fisheries privatization? I got a couple of emails when the abstract was circulated, and it's, what is this? You know, we need to understand what this is. And having studied this topic for quite a while, talking with many different people throughout the state and internationally, fishermen, economists, policymakers, you get really different answers to the question of what are the processes of privatization that are going on in our state and many fishing regions. So I've heard that from economists, it's primarily a restructuring of property rights, so addressing the property rights problems of fisheries, one that's meant to maximize aggregate profit or resource rent from a fishery that doesn't have property rights. I've heard from managers that it's a panacea. It doesn't just maximize rent. increases human safety at sea and provides conservation benefits. It's sort of this win-win. And then from some grumpy fishermen in Kodiak, I hear a lot of things about it being an elite takeover of a public resource. So this topic is very contested, and studying it, you sort of learn all of these different dimensions. One of the main ways, just for those of you that haven't been following the literature on fisheries privatization, one of the main impetuses or catalysts for making the access rights to fisheries private property came in the 1950s. And so this is a quote from Gordon saying the main issue with fisheries is that it's not private property. Therefore, the rent or profit that we can get from fisheries is not capable of being appropriated by anybody. And we see a very similar statement, an economist, Hannison, in 2004, saying the same basic thing. The basic economic problem with fisheries is a lack of property rights. So another quote here from an economist, Weiland in 2000, saying the economics profession's most important policy achievement must surely be getting ITQs or individual transferable quotas on the policy agenda for fisheries. So we see this economic management of fisheries really taking hold in recent years. So I, like Marie and Steve Langdon and some others in the state, have been studying how these processes of fisheries privatization really reshape nature-society relationships, really reshape fishing as an enterprise. And so I've been trying to study this, as I mentioned, with a group of colleagues, trying to understand how the processes of changing open fisheries into private access ones really reshapes the fisheries system. So there's a couple of review articles out in the academic literature recently, and this issue has also had some popular press recently trying to explore what are these changes that happen with privatization. So privatization involves, as I've been mentioning, the redefinition of access rights or privileges to open, common, or state-owned fisheries into more private ones. And there's a whole host of processes that go along with that, including marketization, so creating mechanisms for the monetary exchange of fishing rights between individuals, corporations, or other collectives, and then commodification, so giving a market value, giving a price value to the actual access rights to fish. So that's a little bit of definitions in terms of how we might situate this topic of privatization. About 80% of the world's private property, private access rights to fish are managed under an individual transferable quota program. That means they're transferable and sellable on the open market. 35 nations have restructured major fisheries, implementing about 400 access privatization programs, managing over about 850 species worldwide.
Courtney?
Yes.
Are you also including in your definition of privatization limited access programs that aren't ITQs?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think within the spectrum of privatization, moving from sort of open, anyone can go fish, to limited commodified access, that limited entry for salmon or herring, for example, would be an example of a more privatized set of entry, because you need to have a cash flow to buy that access privilege, and they're limited.
So the privatization is really, it differs to the extent to which what those property rights are actually allocated for.
Right, and there is a distinction too between the access right to fish and the actual physical fish once they're caught. And so there's certainly a lot of regulations about that manages the relationship between the access to and then the actual fish itself. So the state or the federal government can say, we're not having a fishery this year, so your property rights to access aren't actually the same as they would be with a different resource that isn't managed at those levels.
Okay. Excuse me, I'm naive and confused.
Oh, sorry, I've already confused you.
No, just in terms of the use of the word privatization, maybe this is related to next question, but if there are quotas and the government or the public sector, somebody says we need to have quotas to manage the fisheries rather than we own this bay and you can't come in unless I tell you. To me, quotas, public sector quotas aren't privatization. So, and I was thinking also, at first I thought, well, you meant the people fishing. I thought, no, those are private people. Okay, it's the resource. But it's not like airlines where you could privatize the airline system, but the airspace is not privatized at all. So I'm confused a bit about how you're using that term.
Yeah, and you actually brought up, I think, two really important parts. One is the sort of, when I say the word quota, I don't mean a sort of catch limit on a number of fish. So the total allowable catch, or a quota, has been set for a long time for most fisheries. What I'm talking about here is the individual allocation of a particular percentage of that quota to a person, as a commodified right that then can be bought and sold on a market. So that's the sort of shift. But you also brought up a really good point about an access right versus a geographic space and ownership to that property of ocean space. And there is, I think, some synergy between efforts to start spatial planning and privatization of ocean space that are occurring with a similar kind of logic to that which is unfolding with the access rights to fish. But I'm not talking about any kind of spatial management for this.
So is what you're saying then that at the very bottom of privatization is just limited entry? You need to get in so you can go fish. And the top, if you will, that you're talking about is individual fishing quotas.
Yeah, the individual fishing quota takes a separate step, and it says you are allocated this percentage of a catch.
Well, when I'm thinking about what you're talking, that's kind of the range.
It's sort of the range, although, like I said, with the spatial planning, there's even further development of what that privatization process is. So I think these are great questions, and it hints at the complexity of these dimensions of privatization. And I'm not trying to argue for any sort of simple definition of this is privatization, this isn't, but that shift from open access to more of a privatized access is what I've been doing my research on. So hopefully it'll become more clear as I go along. Sorry about the initial confusion. Just to also situate you, those that aren't in the anthropology geography realm, the framework that I use to study these processes of change is political ecology. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to understand how these processes of privatization in various ways reshape fishery systems and places. So in my work in Kodiak, I'm trying to understand how global processes in discourse and economy actually shape the lives of fishermen and fishing connected people in Kodiak. And really important in this framework is situating people and resources and power relationships, so trying to understand how those play out, recognizing uneven distributions of wealth and power, and highlighting the centrality of certain questions of class and race and gender in these social analyses. So some of the early research I did in 2005 and 6 gave me a suggestion that people viewed ITQs or individual transferable quotas, IFQs, as a fundamental change. So this was a survey of halibut IFQ fishermen across the state and actually throughout the whole U.S., those that own halibut quota. Do you believe that ITQs are changing fishing lifestyles, and do you believe that ITQs are changing the values in fishing? And you can see there's a very strong agreement with this statement that there are some fundamental changes going along. There's a host of positive and negative impacts. I know Gunnar's done some work on this early in the halibut fishery of what are you perceiving to be positive and negative impacts of these, and it's a mixed bag. People talk a lot in the halibut fishery about safety and better price and improved management. On the negative side, there's these large barriers to entry where it costs so much to get into halibut. A goal of the economic restructuring of property rights is to consolidate the fishery so it becomes more profitable if there's less people, and so that's seen as a loss to many folks, and also unfair to small operations, unfair to crew, some other things coming out of that research. What I focused, the majority of my dissertation work was looking at the small communities in the Gulf of Alaska, and particularly on Kodiak Island, and this shows the outflow of ITQ fishing rights from those communities under 1,500 in the Gulf of Alaska between 1995 and 2010. And then some of Steve Langdon's work looking at limited entry salmon permits and the number of Alaska Native fishermen that held those permits when they were issued in 1970 and looking into the 80s. And to my knowledge, I don't think the state continues to collect ethnicity data on permit ownership. I know Kate Reedy-Mashner has done some work in the Aleut region, just sort of showing this is even more, the outflow has been even stronger into the current decades. So this study, I built upon that dissertation work to try to understand, in the small communities, it was pretty obvious. Even the folks that had weathered the change of limited entry and halibut ITQs still felt that those policies were somewhat detrimental to their communities. They're small, fisheries had changed, you need a lot of money to get into them, and it seemed to be a generally negative policy change. But I wanted to understand how in a place like Kodiak, a really diverse port, lots of large vessels, lots of small vessels, what is the full range of perspectives on these policy changes? So I had a 3-year NSF study to explore these 3 main questions. How have various groups experienced privatization? How does privatization compare in people's minds to other drivers of change, economic, ecological, etc.? And then how does privatization affect individual and community well-being? So who's been to Kodiak? Lots of us. It's one of the most diverse ports in the country. It typically ranks in the top 3 in terms of processing value for fisheries. 1 in 3 jobs in Kodiak is in seafood. There's an increasingly diverse makeup of the population. There's been a long-standing Filipino community tied to the fish processing realm in Kodiak for a long time, and we see a Alaska Native population about 16%, which has stayed constant over the decades. These numbers are a couple years out of date, but you can see there's a variety of species, both in terms of value and volume, that pass through the docks of Kodiak, groundfish being really important in terms of volume. So pollock and other groundfish make up quite a lot of the volume coming across the docks in Kodiak. So the methods for this project, as I mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I tend to do mixed method ethnographic approach, and some of what I was able to do was work with key respondents in each of the sort of direct fishery groups, so crew members, captains, processing plant employees, and they helped guide the kinds of questions that I asked to that group of people. So I was able to get some feedback from local experts on how to best approach this project. And so from those key respondent interviews, we did about 75 interviews with folks from all of these groups. We were also able to go out on a few fishing trips just to gain some traction and some detail for what people were telling us in the interviews. And then from the interviews, we did a lot of qualitative analysis that informed the development of a large mailed survey that we were able to get to a large group of people in Kodiak. Gunnar?
How did you select the semi-structured interview folks?
They were, the key respondents helped us generate a list of knowledgeable, longtime residents of Kodiak, knowledgeable about their fishery, gear group, so in each of these we had, vessel owners. We tried to get the main fisheries, and we got recommendations of who had been longtime participants in the salmon fishery, the trawl fishery, those sorts of things. So they were direct referrals and a bit of snowball sampling as well. So a captain of one of the trawl vessels might recommend somebody else. It wasn't a random sample.
Yeah, just following up on that, briefly, it's been my observation that in talking with people about fisheries policy or controversial issues, I often discovered seemingly similar people with widely divergent opinions, who see and interpret the same sort of set of facts or events which they both witnessed in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're looking for kind of to gain insight on sort of how representative is each of these two people of the whole group, I'm wondering to what extent in any of your last 3 groups you were able in some way to get some sense of that.
In the last 3 groups, you mean
the semi-structured, the participant, and the mailed survey?
So the semi-structured interviews, as I mentioned, because we were trying to target I basically wanted people that had a long-term experience in their fishery in Kodiak, and that number is somewhat limited. And so you see the same actual people who serve on the fisheries advisory committees and the different gear groups. And so in Kodiak, they're sort of a well-defined group. That said, I did try to target, because this was about ITQs and this large issue of privatization, I tried to target those very vocal proponents of those systems and those opponents to make sure I was getting some balance in terms of what I was hearing. The mailed survey was a randomized sample that in some way attempts to triangulate or test if what we were hearing in the interviews was widespread. And in fact, there's an interesting finding that comes up with regard to crew. I heard really different things in the interview from crew than I heard from the mailed survey, and I think it has something to do with the sample of crew who filled out the survey. So I'll talk more to that, but it certainly was a concern and one I think is really important to keep reflecting on. Yep.
I guess I have a question about this process seems like you would end up with the people who are still there.
Yes.
And so how did you get to sampling the people who are no longer there because the system pushed them out? And so it seems like the long-term interviews, the key respondents and the semi-structured, you get a certain kind of bias from the long-term, but they would be more likely the long-term survivors as opposed to people who aren't there anymore.
That's a really good point. And I think a couple things. I think for the interviews, that's absolutely true. I didn't take much effort to contact folks that no longer lived in Kodiak, although I heard stories about so-and-so who made a bunch of money and moved to Arizona. And so I had a list of names and understood that the number of those folks existed. With the survey, if somebody kept a mailing address in Kodiak, which many boat owners do, and they might not live in Kodiak full time, they still would have been eligible to receive a survey. And in fact, we do see some non-full-time residents of Kodiak still identifying as Kodiak residents. So some of that comes out in the survey.
Well, can I also say that each fishery is rationalized differently, and that people participate in more than one. So they might have been rationalized out of one particular fishery, but would still be participating in another. So they would still still be there. Right?
Absolutely.
Displaced individuals who are still in Kodiak.
Or who might not have gotten halibut quota, but they're still salmon fishing.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really big issue for crew, and it's one of the main reasons I'm not comfortable interpreting fully the data that I've gathered from crew, because I think a lot of the displacement has been silenced by a new generation of fishermen that are crewing that hadn't lived through those processes before. This is a look at the breakdown of kinds of people that we were able to target in the interviews by group. We did talk to several non-direct fishery participants, but community leaders. Everything in Kodiak seems to revolve around fish, so even if you aren't a direct participant, you tend to have experiences and opinions about the fisheries. So the survey was meant to reach a large range of people and also test some of what we were hearing in the qualitative interviews. We did a standard 4-step mailing process for that and tried to make the survey instrument comparable to some other work that's going on in New England. And actually, I don't know if folks are familiar, Richard Polneck's anthropologist out of University of Rhode Island. He's done some work in Southeast Alaska looking at job satisfaction and well-being in fisheries. So some of the questions that we have are directly comparable to previous work in Southeast as well as New England. Tried to entice people to send in their surveys with these $2 bills and heard a lot of feedback about, oh, I just threw my packet out and lost my $2. Could you send me another one? And some folks who didn't feel it was appropriate to send any sort of monetary compensation sent me, one guy actually sent me 2 $1 bills back in the mail. And he said, I really wanted the $2 bill, but I don't feel comfortable taking your money. But he kept the 2. And then I heard some other stories about where these $2 bills ended up in Kodiak, which strip clubs and whatever, and I didn't want to hear all of that. So it became quite a funny point of conversation. One thing that was not funny was all of the returned mail that we got. This was a letter announcing the survey was coming, and you can see the large stack of returned addresses. So one thing, again, with the crew, they tended to have addresses that weren't current, or they listed the bar, or they listed a captain's address. One of the boat owners who'd filled out a survey said they got 10 of these crew surveys to their box address. So clearly the sampling with crew was not without problems. It was a 10-page survey. The folks that did fill it out really spent a lot of time. I have an incredible amount of data that I'm still sort of going through with this. This was a randomized process, trying to account for some of what Gunnar and others were bringing up. I tried to sample permit holders in both federal and state, people who held permits in both federal and state fisheries in a number of years in Kodiak. I wanted it to be somewhat current because I wanted their addresses to be current. There was about 1,500 names in Kodiak proper and about 170 in Kodiak's rural communities, and I just took a random sample of 50%. Crew members do have a license if they don't hold a permit, so I took a sample of about 600, I took a sample about 50% of the 630 or so people that held licenses in 3 or more years in this recent period. So it wasn't a perfect sampling rationale, but I thought it was one that seemed to work with the attention to trying to get good addresses from the state and federal system. I think so we got about a 30% response rate overall, which I was hoping for better. When I did the halibut survey, I got a 48% response rate, and that was all around the country. So I thought, oh, Kodiak people will turn theirs in. And I think some of it was the issue of mailing and maybe surveys not getting to folks. Also, someone in a family would fill one out, and they would think, oh, well, my brother filled one out or my husband filled one out. I don't need to fill one out. So we got less back from folks who, a SetNet site might have 7 permits attached to it, and so we only tended to get 1 back from the family. Crew members, we only got 16% back. So I'm, again, hesitant to understand if the crew is being well represented in this group. But I think in general, the major fishery roles, gear groups, and primary fisheries of Kodiak are generally represented in terms of the number of people that participate in these fisheries. Mostly male, mostly white in terms of demographics. The median age, I believe, is on the next slide, 48 or so, and a range of incomes as well. A lot of generations of fishing experience in Kodiak, and about half saying they did grow up in Kodiak and half not. Average years of experience, 27 years. So remember I introduced the 3 questions that this study was exploring. I'm going to go through each of those questions and kind of provide you some initial results of how I'm starting to answer these questions. The first question is people's experiences of privatization. So these are drawn both from the interviews and the survey. I have a sense from both of these, the survey and the interviews, that people feel that privatization is changing core values in fishing. What came across really clearly in interviews is that fishermen, no matter how they felt, no matter what gear group they were part of or what ownership or crew class they were part of, they tended to talk about core values in fishing. Among these are hard work, opportunity, and fairness. So no matter where they were on the spectrum of supporting or opposing privatization, they tended to say things like, it used to be you just worked hard and that's how you got your money, and now it's different. They used to say, those guys that are complaining about IFQs just didn't work hard enough to deal with the new system. So they're complaining, but it was about this hard work value. Yes?
Yeah, just coming back to what you said about the demographics, do you think that those demographics, in terms of the return in your sample, were representative? Is it really that old a population in terms of age and years of experience, or were those more likely to be the people who turned in the questionnaire and had more historical experience to reflect on this?
That's a good question. I hadn't limited the survey to those folks with a certain number of experience. I basically said if you've had 20 years experience, you can answer these questions. If you haven't, just leave them blank. But there might have been an extra incentive for folks with that long-term experience to send in their survey because they had more to reflect upon or it meant more to them. I haven't looked at that in terms of the numbers of, the demographics in terms of if it's comparable to the population at large. The sampling procedure I used did look at that 12-year window, so it selected people equally whether they fished in 2000 or 2012.
So is it really an aging fishery, or is that just in terms of the people in it? Are there young people going into it, or?
That's a great question, and it's actually a new project I'm getting started looking at the graying of the fleet. But yeah, I think overall in the state there is a demographic shift in that permit holders tend to be older now than in previous decades, and different regions have different problems with that. Kodiak, to my people's general opinion, is that yeah, there is an older demographic now, and they're actually very worried about the younger generation. So that'll come out in a few slides. Mm-hmm.
How much of the survey was open-ended and how much was multiple choice?
I was probably.
How did people respond to the open-ended?
We received pages and pages of extra commentary from many people. I would say about 60 to 70% of it was close-ended because I wanted to do some comparative work with that, and it came out of a lot of open-ended interviews. But certainly there was open-ended pieces that we were able to code and then compare as well. But fishing's a big deal for people who participate in fishing and in Kodiak especially. So people had a lot to share often. So they would even, extend those closed-ended answers into open-ended answers that they want.
The survey came out when it wasn't fishing season.
Yes, I think I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was. I think it was late. It was in between some of the winter fisheries. I think it was April. Kodiak salmon doesn't really get started till June, and I think the crew was on the border of that, and that could be another reason why the response rate was so poor. So here's a few quotes about some of these core values. This opportunity and fairness quote here, no one can afford to do it anymore. New guy, I'm talking new guys like my son who's 30 years old and he's been fishing since he was 9. There's no way he can get up enough money to buy a boat and buy $28 a pound IFQ fish. There's no way. So this idea that many people who'd come to Kodiak for opportunity, there's all these stories of I showed up with $6 in my pocket and now I'm, I own 2 crab boats, and these kind of policies make it very hard for somebody to do that in the future. So this idea, this core value of you should be able to make it in fishing without necessarily having a rich uncle or something. A lot of discussion, not just from crewmen, but from all roles in the fishery, that crewmen were particularly a group that got that had unfair outcomes. This is a quote from a long-term crew. You no longer have any power as a crewman. The power is shifted away from the people who actually do the work.
Yeah, I understand the first 2 quotes, that basically the medallion price has gone up. That's kind of what they're saying. I don't understand the 3rd quote. Is that the same thing?
Well, there'll be some quotes in a few slides too that'll show you the ways in which captains who own ITQs, maybe for halibut, might say to a crew member, well, if you work with me on salmon, I might let you have that ITQ trip. And so it's before you could get a halibut trip because you had skills, you were good at, processing the fish fast, and you were a good crew to have. And now it's more of this, they dangle this potential lucrative trip over you. The word in Kodiak was Q-teased, that captains would Q-tease you and say, you might get this halibut trip or you might get to go crabbing, but you've got to do this unlucrative fishery first. So the idea is that crew weren't able to bargain because they don't own the rights to fish. So they weren't able.
Did the crew have? So what I'm gathering of this course is that the value of an IFQ share has gone way up once you rationalize that. But is that true? The crew shares of those?
So the ITQs for halibut went only to boat owners, and this caused a lot of issue in Kodiak because skippers, people who ran the boat, in some cases for years and years, got nothing. It went all to the boat owner. Crew didn't get anything. For the Bering Sea crab fishery, there was a small 3% skipper, I believe it was just skippers, got 3% of the total allowable catch, which is a very small amount. But in halibut, there was no crew.
Did the whole value of what that boat caught go up enough that the crew?
Yeah. So this is another good hinting at what's coming in the future. But yeah, initially for halibut there was no lease fee because people were initially given halibut ITQs free of charge. Over time, as people started purchasing those rights, the next generation, they had debt service payments. So they had to take a lease fee off the top so that they could pay the debt on that. Over time, that became institutionalized where people felt comfortable leasing it, first at 40%, then at 50%, then at 60%. So yes, it's true that the price of halibut went up. And so in general, the fishery is more valuable, but the percentage that goes to crew is actually much less than it used to be. And in the crab fishery in the Bering Sea, it's even more pronounced. The lease fees are about 70 to 80%. So the crew and the captain and anyone on the boat they're all working for 20% now or 30% of what they would have historically.
So why does that give you the conditions for what you call the QTs?
Well, because if I think it creates a situation where people feel like they're relatively worse off compared to owners. But if the fishery is still lucrative, they're still making money, they still value those trips. So.
Well, doesn't it really work in that before you just took a fishery, it took capital and labor to harvest the fishery. And you were the labor, you were a critical piece of it. So when they gave out the quotas, they gave out the quotas only based on who owned the capital.
Mm-hmm.
And so they essentially massively enriched the owners of capital, and they left the labor off the table. And so you basically, it's almost like, getting rid of union in a way.
Absolutely, and
labor has no power anymore because they don't have, they were responsible for enabling the harvest of the resource, but now their access to it it's completely moved out of their camp.
Absolutely, and I think some of the research you did on the Bering Sea crab had a couple of nice quotes showing that we invested our lives and our labor and we're given nothing, but if you invest your capital, and that was a deliberate decision of the way this has been done worldwide, Iceland, New Zealand, investing the owners of capital over the labor class. And I think that comes through in these narratives. People talk about the status they used to have as a crew member who was highly skilled. You had your certain knives you used, you were highly sought after, and that changed a lot when these policies went into place. Gunnar?
But you also have to keep in mind that the fundamental economics of the value of a labor changes. You change the rules of the game, and so when you've got a competitive fishery as existed prior to privatization, then there's a tremendous amount of value in having people who can fish hard, fish long, catch a lot of fish, and when and the way a fishery is, certain kinds of fisheries are prosecuted after you make this management change, that there's less inherent value in that. So changing the rules actually changes how valuable particular skills are. And that is part of what drives the phenomenon that is being talked about in that bottom quote.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It changes, yeah, absolutely, the value of those kinds of skills, and also changes the kinds of people that go into these professions. It used to be that a crew member could make a living, raise a family on a crew salary. That tends not to happen anymore. And you see actually a shift from a share system, a lay system where crew are part and parcel of what the profits are, to more of a wage system. And this is happening in British Columbia. Evelyn Pinkerton has a new paper, 2013, in Marine Policy, on that shift from lay share to wage. Kodiak, they call them $100 a day guys, as sort of a criticism of people that are willing to work for this wage, whereas before it would be a share.
You have potentially two different forms of privatization that are affecting people in Kodiak that would have essentially different values for crew members, right? I mean, you have the privatization for the limited access fishery where they're still competing for a share of the total level catch. And so the skills that Gunnar is talking about in terms of those highliner skills are still going to be valued in that fishery, whereas if you're guaranteed a share of the total allowable catch under ITQs, they might not be as valued. So that could be, some, not necessarily a treatment, but some sort of way to look at exactly like what that transition from one set of privatization to another differentially affects crew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And some of those dynamics do come out in some of the research. Maybe one more, and then I'm going to, two more.
It used to be that capital and labor shared the value, but now capital is divided into those who put the money and those who own the property rights. And so in some ways it's three, and which can be the same person or not. And so it's sort of three separate groups that share.
And one more was up front.
I just had a sense that that's the whole point of your study, is to figure out how the rule change is affecting everybody.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at with this academic ease of reshaping fisheries systems. So how are things actually changing for the people in this currently and the next generation? Here's another quote looking at some of this shared changing values. Appears to me the goal of a lot of fishermen these days isn't so much making a living, but to create wealth. And this idea that this hadn't necessarily been a defining feature of fishery livelihoods in the past in Kodiak. The second piece of this first question, people tended to express opposition or neutrality across the board with a survey to ITQs. I didn't find strong support. And these were a list of 8 Likert scale questions that showed strong interperson reliability. And if you tended to answer a certain way on one, you tended to answer a certain way on another. And I reversed these so that they all were measuring support for ITQs versus opposition, and created a composite from that. And we see, so true opposition would be a score of 8, and true support would be a score of 40. And so we see the means here at 18, sort of below this neutrality, and we see skippers showing sort of the most strong opposition, but not very much divergence here. I expected the crew and skippers to be much more opposed than the owners and owner-operators. I think this is showing there's a lot of mixed opinions among these different gear groups, and a lot of shared sort of feelings about certain things that they feel have impacted Kodiak in particular in a negative way. There is some division among the sort of different groups, though. We're seeing here, this is one of those Likert scale statements. Fisheries would be better managed if they were private rather than public resources. And we see a 30% or so of owners strongly agreeing with that statement. And we don't see any strong agreement among crew. So there is some divergence when you start looking at these individual questions. We see more support for privatization processes among the trawl fleet than others, and particularly the pollock. So right now in the Gulf of Alaska, groundfish, you may be aware, there's a move to rationalize the bycatch species and potentially the whole fishery. And so we see among the pollock fleet, these are, I believe, mostly owners here, more support than the rest of the group, and statistically significant difference here among the pollock fleet. In my previous research, I was able to show that income was related to whether you supported or didn't support privatization processes with the halibut. So the lower your income, the less you tended to show support. I didn't find that same effect here. There was no pattern to my knowledge with income. And then the third piece of this question one, a kind of finding, is that crew were identified as an especially negatively impacted group, and this had to do with consolidation and job loss, some of what we've been mentioning, the changes in fishing practices, the changes in compensation from shared wages, and the erosion of power status and skill. Here's the QTs, one of the QTs quote, "Some of these quota lords are friends of mine, and they kind of know the deal, but they're caught up in this whole capitalist thing. I've given up on the halibut and the blackcod fishery. It's just a lost fishery to me at this point, chasing, allowing myself to get QT'd." And then the person talked about what that meant, which was you've got to do all this gear work, and you might not get to go on the trip anyway, but if you really want that halibut trip, you'll do it, sort of thing. So across the whole survey, we see strong agreement that crew members were a group that were negatively impacted by ITQs. I think there's strong support for this in other parts of the world as well. So I'm shifting on. Sorry to kind of blow through some of this. I do want to leave time for questions, but moving on to the second question of how does privatization compare to other kinds of changes? Privatization is viewed by most people in the interviews as a pretty fundamental shift, and so many people compared it to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So when the oil spill happened, there were people that worked for the cleanup, and certain people got disbursements, and there was money coming into some and not to others. And so this was a quote saying that when the oil spill happened, it tore the community apart. It made enemies, as it did when IFQs came down. Both those things just really tore us apart socially. Money was thrown at us. It didn't fall out right for a lot of people. And a lot of stories here about conflicts between skippers who had run a boat for a long time, receiving nothing, and owners who had received all of it and not working out. It was against the kind of ethic that people thought should have been put in place. But here was this policy that was, gifting a lot of money to one group and nothing really to the other group. Another way in which this was talked about is that it created conflict, and it also created differential impacts. Here's a quote: "Privatization has been one of the most divisive and identifiably negative influences on the community. Now, certainly some people have benefited greatly to the wealth generated, and you can certainly argue that it is very positive. But the fact that a few people obtain that wealth increased the disparity amongst neighbors, and I think that has generally been bad for the community. The other types of changes seem to have impacted basically everybody, so they haven't been better or worse off necessarily for anybody." So this idea of disparity and differential kind of impact seemed like an important feature that people brought up again and again in interviews. Again, testing this or trying to understand, do a broad group of fishery participants in Kodiak agree with this? We see strong agreement with this statement that ITQs created conflict in the Kodiak community.
Why does that previous slide go to 100% urban?
Oh,
that's number of people. I'm sorry. I'm answering.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
it's confusing.
Right.
Yeah, so about, yeah. Okay. There were about 260 responses, so that should make sense. Some of the concerns that came out of an open-ended question on what are you concerned about in terms of Kodiak fisheries, we see economics driving a lot of people's concern, the low price of fish, increasing costs of fish, and many other effects that folks are worried about. Really interesting question. This is shifting into my interest in trying to measure and get people's perceptions of their well-being, their satisfaction with their fishing livelihood and their community. One of the questions I ask people in interviews is, do you think Kodiak is a healthy community? And many people would say, just go look at the harbor. And they meant this in very different ways. They would say, the community used to be so bustling. There were vessels in and out. There were tons of people walking the docks. There were so many businesses open downtown. Now look at it. Just go look at the harbor. And then another group would say, it's bustling. Things are moving. Go look at the harbor. It's an active fishing town. Go look at the harbor and anywhere else in the state, and you'll see a different place. So this relative comparison of what Kodiak was, what it is now, and also how does Kodiak compare to other places that might be experiencing changes that are even more pronounced. Generally, people tended to think about Kodiak as a healthy place, but less healthy compared to the past. And people did not have a strong consensus about why they felt like it was less healthy than in the past. Also, in this look at individual and community well-being, people tended to focus on negative impacts of privatization. This is from the survey. What effect has privatization had on your fishing business? We see mixed results, but more negative than positive, and we see a very strong signal of the negative views of the Kodiak, the effects that privatization has had on the community of Kodiak.
Quick clarification.
Yes.
I have a question for you. Were you lumping all privatization? Does the question lump
the question
entry and
yeah, and actually I think it had a parentheses that said privatization, for example, limited entry, halibut ITQs, etc.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similar question on your last slide there about the definition of healthy.
Yes.
Did you define for folks environmentally, economically?
I didn't, and tried to pull out from their answers how they thought about it. I actually tended not to ask much about ITQs or privatization till the end of the interview, and tried to solicit what came up and what people were talking about. And you couldn't stop people from talking about this punctuated shift in how people viewed the community. People talked a lot about ITQs in particular, and the shift from how it was before that to current. So here's another one of these Likert scale, trying to get many questions to see if they're all saying similar things. One thing that comes out of this to me that's really important is this large neutral blob. I think a lot of people in Kodiak are sick of talking about privatization, and so they have this, just like my hands are thrown up over it.
Well,
James?
I think too, they, as much as they might dislike the privatization, very few of them probably want to go back to Derby days where they're battling each other for, openers that may last a couple of days or a few weeks. At least with the IQ programs, there's a little bit more certainty in terms of how much fish you're going to get if you're in the fishery. And what your time scale of when you can catch those fish are.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think that actually came up a lot in the processing plant employee interviews, where so much has been said about how bad the derbies were on the harvesting side. A lot of the plant employees actually really loved those short openers because they got a lot of overtime and it was kind of a lot of money, and they talk about wanting those derbies back. But there's different perspectives on past versus current. So 77% of survey respondents listed some negative impacts for the community of Kodiak, and they're listed here. Only 13% listed positive effects, and those are listed here. I'm not sure if you guys can see them in the back of the room, but stabilized local economy, higher paying and more jobs for crew, better prices. On the negative side, absentee owners, reduced crew shares, downturn of local economy, negative shift, demographic changes. Here's that graying of the fleet, loss of fishing town identity. Here's another quote. IFQs did affect the community, but I suppose it's all relative. Kodiak, it's a healthy fishing community compared to other fishing communities that their bread and butter is fishing. We're robust compared to other communities, like some in Southeast Alaska that don't really even exist anymore because the fisheries aren't as robust as they used to be in that neck of the woods. We're so diversified here. We don't depend on one species. That's what saved us. I think we're the center of the universe when it comes to commercial fishing. A lot of focus on diversity being both a unifier and a divider. Kodiak, at the council meetings, we can never get our voice heard because there's a million different positions on any one issue. But I think people are converging on this idea that the diversity of their fleets is actually a strength when some small communities are really struggling to stay in fishing. A second main piece that comes out of this third question is that there is a large concern about the next generation. Here's a couple of quotes. We're an aging fleet. When a bunch of us die, I don't know if turning over that quota share is going to be a positive effect because I think it's going to have to disperse. I don't know how many young guys have a cash flow to buy into it. And another quote, there's a huge graying of the fleet. I'm 63 years old. My main complaint about the whole way that all this giving fish away to individual goes is that the young guys don't stand a chance. On this note, there's a Young Fisherman Summit occurring next week here in Anchorage. So if you're interested in this topic, it would be good of you to view some of the younger generation at that conference. Would you advise a young person to get into fishing, yes or no, by gear group? One interesting thing to me, the longline fleet, which, you know, cod, but halibut makes up a large portion of it, the largest group that said no, they wouldn't encourage young people to get into fishing. I wouldn't have.
It's too expensive.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
We're trawling.
But this is interesting, a finding for the sort of policy of ITQs that's continually perpetuated as a good thing for fisheries. If a majority of people in that fishery are saying no, I wouldn't advise people to get into it because
people are in that response?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And when you have so many different categories in some of your questions, do you have big enough ends to be able to generalize?
That's a good question. I do. That first slide that showed the general breakdown was the percentage of all, but that is a good point. I think some of the jig, for example, and tender, and these last three are the least.
We need to put the ends in so anybody can really tell. I mean, is that just happens to be a very small subset of your sample, or are there enough in each category that you could actually?
Yeah, I think from the trawl over, there's probably 30 plus in each group. Set net, seine would probably be more, but these would be less. So yeah, thanks for that suggestion.
Courtney, what does it mean get into fishing? Like as crew, as?
That's how the question was worded, so they could interpret that however they want. So a couple of more slides before I conclude. What are some things about the Kodiak fishing community that you hope never change? The small town feeling, fishing opportunities, excitement of fishing. This is actually something that's come up again in interviews, and I was talking with Evelyn Pinkerton, who does similar work at Simon Fraser in British Columbia. And this was a point that she brought up in conversation with Svein Gentoff in Norway, talking about how the career of what we do as social scientists who study fisheries is becoming a lot less fun because fishermen are less fun because they're grumpy and complaining, and how interesting it is to talk with folks in Kodiak about fishing used to be fun, and they describe it in that way, and they don't think about it in that way anymore. It used to go to the dock and share a cup of coffee with someone, and it was kind of it was part of this fun lifestyle, and now it's changed. And so I'm trying to put some meat on that kind of statement and figure out in what ways has it changed.
How much of that is just nostalgia?
A great question. This is actually one of my a body of literature that I don't know much about is sort of cognitive psychology and nostalgia, and generally grass is greener in the past. So I'm gonna
Yeah, I think that brings me to a criticism. You know, if you don't really investigate the trade-offs and the drivers of how people are actually thinking about the past and the current situation, then you're kind of having an underlying current or a bias towards, you know, romanticizing.
Totally. Yep.
And so if you don't really look at all at the alternatives and then how people trade off between what they have right now or what they had in the past, then
Rachel's got a good point, I think, to add.
Yeah, well, just I did research in Kodiak in the 1980s, and people were saying some of the exact same things.
Yeah, totally.
Bemoaning the good old days, talking about the crewmen that couldn't even mend a net or anything, and so it is hard to tell how much of it is caused by privatization or is just part of the evolution.
Yeah.
They were.
So that could be the start of.
Yeah, but even before that, even some of these they were already talking about the good old days.
Gunnar.
I think the perhaps slightly more subtle point is that if there's a policy question, say the policy question is, you know, are ITQs good or some other thing good, then the choice is not between the ITQs we have today and the past. The choice is between the ITQs we have today and whatever else we would have today, the conditions under some alternative policy framework that we might have had instead of ITQs, if we hadn't made that policy switch. And so it is what would have happened if we either stuck with what we had, which is a derby system, or gone to some alternative thing. And almost all of those systems would have, certainly the derby would not have stayed the way that was, and nor would any other particular thing have stayed what it would have initially been. And that becomes a very subtle thing to think through.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the current discussion with the Gulf of Alaska groundfish discussion with privatization, there are some lessons learned that people are trying to inject into designing a future program that would have maybe more community level protections built into it. So yeah, I think these are really great points. I'm just going to conclude because I think we're running out of time. So my overall question is, as we'll remember, how is fisheries privatization remaking fisheries systems? I think there's some strong evidence to suggest that people perceive privatization to be a fundamental change, one that changes core values, one that has differential impacts and has caused conflict in the past. Crew being a particularly important group to understand, and also the next generation. Kodiak fishermen, when you ask them this in a variety of ways, tend to show opposition or neutrality. And I found in my survey anyway, little evidence for strong support except for the pollock fleet. And I think it's important to note a lot of folks have benefited quite a lot financially from these programs, and they're still offering some cautionary tales of things that they had expressed in terms of some opposition. And in general, people tend to perceive the impacts in Kodiak to be negative. And this was actually stolen from an anthropology conference I was just at. So I had that quote in the beginning about the economics profession's most glorious gift was putting ITQs on the agenda. So I was making a call to the anthropologists in the room of what is the contribution of our field, and maybe helping rethink how we might amend something like an ITQ program to address some of these social inequities that people identify as being really important. So I'm writing all this up and haven't gotten anything published on it yet, but would certainly be happy to meet with anyone to talk about it, and certainly want to put acknowledgments up to a large group of folks who helped me, including Liza Mack, who did some wonderful transcribing of all those glorious interviews, and some references here for anyone that's interested. I'd be happy to send the PowerPoint to you as well. Thank you. Gunnar was gonna.
Yeah, I love to talk. Two quick observations. One of the the thousands of debates that ITQs raise on the crew member thing, and this is simplistic, but this is a simplification of a big debate. But for example, you could say have 5 1/5 time jobs turning into 1 full-time job.
Right.
Okay, now, so you're going to have, what you're going to have is 4 people that are out of a fishing opportunity, and 1 person having arguably much better fishing opportunity, a year-round stable job. And again, I'm simplifying that. Now, the numbers in that kind of thing are always going to work out with more people adversely affected than positively affected, and yet it's a valid question to say which is a better way for the community to be. Although there's many other dimensions to that. But what I'm saying is that the numbers are inherent. Anything that takes a lot of part-time or benefit stuff and makes it into one bigger thing is inherently going to work against you with the numbers.
I think that's a really good point for the numbers, but just to build on that a little I think it's important to understand whose perception of what is a more preferred position. Is that full-time or is that part-time? Because a lot of crew who are piecing together jobs in various realms actually view the part-time 1 week way better than a full-time. And in fact, it's different kinds of people that do the full. So I think that's really important. So we can't simplify it just to look at numbers, but we also can't take a maybe dominant idea of what is a good job in our mind as academics to put onto crew who might think really differently.
One other quick point. I think that one thing economists would emphasize is that something I would encourage you to pursue in the future as you look at this really important topic is that what you're lumping under as privatization is, and part of our mutual confusion about what this means is the fact that any particular program like this has multiple dimensions, and the way, so you can't say, well, privatization results in this. Right. It is, so just for example, 3 dimensions are in quote privatization are, is what you privatize marketable or not? Second, how is it allocated initially? Third, do you have, for example, an owner on board requirement?
Right.
And each of these things, just all 3 of those can quite drastically change the way it plays out both economically and socially. And so I think a fruitful thing to pursue would be how the quote, this is again simplifying, how the way you do privatization affects these outcomes. And one of the experiments is what, in fact, what Matt was talking about, sort of the actual differences that exist between some of these programs or internationally.
Right, definitely.
Because some of the effects you talk about are, quote, even worse, say in BC, where they had no owner on board.
Right, absolutely. Those are really important. Toby?
Just a quick question. Are you able to tease out how, or a link to subsistence fisheries? Which are the people that participate that you interviewed are, how did the ones that participate in subsistence feel about it versus all those?
That's a great question. In the previous work I had done in the rural communities, that was a big part of it. And we saw a very strong link between commercial fishery participation and subsistence fishery. It wasn't a part of our interview or survey process for this. It was more the commercial end. And in some charter recreational. Ian, and then I think.
So a request, I would like a copy of the PowerPoint.
Sure.
Thank you. And an observation, I think we spent a lot of last year looking at agriculture and agriculture both in Alaska and globally. I'm sort of struck by some of the parallels in the structural adjustment process between this and agriculture. And so the third thing I'd offer is, having just watched the weekend they recently in that Alaska Far Away documentary on the colony project here in Alaska and some of the history there, and I'm struck by the fact that, as we talked about at the MPRB workshop a couple of years ago on social science, how undocumented Alaska is. I mean, by and large, you're doing pioneering work here in these communities that we've never had anthropological information or even economic information about beyond a pretty descriptive level before. So this is a great baseline. But beyond that, being able to share and tell these stories, we want to share talk about how anthropologists can contribute. One of the great anthropological contributions I've observed in policy circles is the power of the individual voice. And the quotes you put up there are one way of doing it. Another way of doing it through film.
Yep.
And so if you're interested in perhaps pursuing some of these interviews and perhaps trying to get this into some sort of documentary format, they can be pretty compelling ways of capturing this. And I'm struck, we had a conversation recently about how a whole generation of fisheries policy pioneers in Alaska, the Quintillions, if you like, who are at that point in their lives but not going to be around much longer, being able to capture adequately their sense of history and how things have changed generation to generation. It may not ever be enough, but it's at least a starting point.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I interviewed Al Birch, for example, who really helped pioneer the trawl fishery in Kodiak, sitting with him thinking I need to record, and I did actually record him, not sure what I'll do with it, but yeah, I think that's a really great suggestion. You had a question?
My question is a little bit more open-ended. So I'm just curious, so what you've presented here today shows a lot of outcomes, right? But it doesn't necessarily identify the mechanism through which certain types of privatization are then affecting or resulting in these outcomes that you've presented today. So I'm curious, if you're not really getting at the mechanism, how informative is something like this to the council, for instance, if you were to present your work to them when they're deciding on what to do with bycatch in the Gulf for privatization?
Well, I think what's coming clear to me anyway is how some of the underlying values that are assumed to be maximized in something like an ITQ system, so a fully commodified tradable right to fish, is not held as a value for even the people that own those fully tradable marketized rights for fish. So I think that's an economic value that's gained a lot of traction worldwide, and I think there's strong evidence to show in Kodiak that's had bad outcomes to individualize and commodify the right to fish in perpetuity. So I think there is a strong statement you could make to policymakers that say, actually what people want maximized is opportunity, fairness, hard work, and a commitment to the place that you live in, your local place. And how could you design a system that would similarly rationalize a derby or a race for fish, but didn't commodify and make tradable that which people are trying to keep local?
Right, but it seems like a lot of what you were presenting today lumps a bunch of different forms of privatization together. I'm sure that people who, especially communities that received CDQ with the pollock in the western Alaska communities and the CQEs, they would all have very different perceptions of what privatization is about versus, I feel like without identifying certain responses for different types of privatization, you don't get that mechanism I mean, like it makes it difficult to inform what types of alternatives are out there for, you know, impacts on Kodiak or other.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I think that can be parsed out a little bit in some, you know, obviously synthesizing a lot of data for this, and so I have specific, you know, reflections on what piece of the policies people are reflecting on and can offer more specific information. But I think the imagining of alternatives and getting feedback on that is a large black hole that I'm hoping to shift into with the new work on the graying of the fleet and what is the next generation doing to get into fishing and trying to resolve some of these questions.
Well, it seems too like some of what's going on is that, I mean, more towards the beginning when they were doing limited entry into fisheries, you know, the real issues that people were discussing is the transferability, because there's the access and then there's the transferability of the right. And I think with these ITQs, you're getting so the gradation that I remember the argument being in the 70s and 80s about whether or not you should be able to transfer that, or does the state maintain ownership of that access that then gets allocated in a way where I'm not giving this to Toby that now is his value, kind of like a liquor license. That, you know, that's the part. It seems like it's just moved more and more towards this goes to an individual person who owns, you know, more and more of all of the rights to this public resource. And it seems like some of the voices that were there on, is that a fair allocation and what will that do? Because, I mean, I worked at the Limited Entry Commission in the 80s, and we were looking at that transfer from villages of limited entry permits, and it just seemed like that argument about having privatizing access in a way that still maintained the, you know, I'm not gifting you with this something that really is not some, I mean, I would question the fundamental whether or not it should be given to a person to have exclusive transfer of rights, because that was the dominoes that set the whole thing off.
Right, and I think now the duration of how long these things have existed, people's feelings about those are changing. The attitudes about is it appropriate to do that changes if you've held one of these ITQs for 20 years, and now, you know, the feelings and assessment of whether leasing is fair or not. You see that shift in Kodiak. It used to be very clear it was not appropriate to charge a lease fee for this, and now it is. And so you've seen that the ethics changing over time.
And what happens? They take the money and they move to Arizona.
Well, it's. I would like to get more empirical data on that. Yeah.
So this is sort of conjecture.
Sorry,
but
no, really.
I was wondering, just because you lived in Kodiak and probably know the villages, would the native villages have a stronger perception around this or a different perception?
They absolutely have a very strong opinion that, starting with the limited entry permit system in the 70s, village fishing changed a lot. It used to be collective, familial, communal. It became individual, competitive. A lot of people got left out. It was bad for the community.
And do they also see some of the IFQs as responsible for the fishing leaving the community?
I think they started earlier with the limited entry salmon. I think there's a lot of complexity in the village economies and communities that we don't see in Kodiak town. There's a lot of historical legacy of colonialism and other things that still play out in various ways. So I think it's a complicated picture there. Matt, sorry.
Actually, my question is probably fairly complicated, so maybe I should talk to you privately. We should let people go here so that they can go back.
People can leave if they want.
And those who want to stay can continue the conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, just to be minimally formal about it, we are sort of typical, you know, at the end of our scheduled time. This is a fascinating topic. All of you are welcome to stay and talk to Courtney as long as she'll talk with you. I myself have to run. I know some other people have to run. Clearly, this topic is a central critically important topic in Alaska fisheries. And I'm delighted that we're getting a very healthy input of anthropologists into this discussion to balance some of the ideas economists have been foisting on us. Even though the economists are right. What I'm saying is I'm thrilled that you and others are looking into this in more detail, and I think there's abundant opportunity to continue this. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and I have cards with my current contact if anyone wants to chat. I actually have to run to a meeting soon, so I won't be able to stay too long, but I do have cards if anyone
I
wants.
forgot my cards,
Oh,
but
thank
we
you.
should, we should talk sometime.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. We enjoyed that.
For sure. Like next week, would that work? I've got your email in my thing, so maybe I'll check my calendar. I meant to actually send you a note before so running around, but yeah, I'll definitely next week.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. That sounds good. Thank you.
Great talk.
Oh,
Good
thanks.
presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, I don't know how long you've been interested in the subject, but I used to be more interested in it.
Yeah, I remember you and Linda, right, had a paper on the eve of ITBQs, or no?
Well, that was Gunner.
That was Gunner, okay.
Yeah, we did a survey.
Okay.
Fleet.
Yeah.
Go back and look at that in 1993.
Yeah, I
Our
remember.
survey. One of the things we did was we predicted what we thought the market price would be based on what people said they would do.
Yep.
And we were within, we were within like 10% of the market price.
Oh, wow.
Came out, so we should have come in business.
I know, right?
A lot of money,
Right.
but of course we at the time.
Yeah.
It strikes me that everything that you found was entirely different by same people or their predecessors in the 1990s or even earlier.